in the current world where there's maybe been a bit of an aversion to big ticket multi-million ERP projects, given there have been some well-known disasters, to be fair. Is ERP dead?
Today we sat down with John Ashworth, Finance Transformation Leader, currently leading a programme at the Crown Estate, and Gareth Bennett, who's leading all the Finance Transformation at News UK.
We talked about, is the ERP dead? What do you do when you go live? And thoughts around leadership and change management on ERP programs.
When I hear the word ERP, it invokes a connotation for me that is old, stuffy, slow-moving, transactional. I think people need to remember that ERPs are really for transformation.
It does leave a legacy. It's making a big difference to business over the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years. And I think, knowing that you're making a difference and that you're delivering something that will really change people's lives, the way the business operates, improve the quality and the efficiency of the business, and will have durability.
John and Gareth have shared kind of their experience of making these programs a success, and hopefully you enjoy it.
Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Just as a starting point, could you give us a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Sure. Gareth Bennett. Really nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me this morning. So I've most recently led a SAP implementation at News UK for the last couple of years.
Super. And I'm John Ashworth. Again, thank you for inviting me today. I'm the Finance Transformation Director at the Crown Estate, and I'm just leading an ERP and finance transformation journey there, having just left Marks & Spencer's, where I was leading their S4 HANA program.
Carolyn Cole, I'm one of the founding partners at Unity Advisory, and I specialise in helping CFOs and their teams modernise and digitise their functions.
Super. So we're kicking off today on the topic of ERP, and as a starting point, I'm interested to know, in the current world where there's maybe been a bit of an aversion to big ticket multi-million ERP projects, given there have been some well-known disasters, to be fair. Is ERP dead?
It's a really good question. When I hear the word ERP, it invokes a connotation for me that is old, stuffy, slow-moving, transactional. I think people need to remember that ERPs are really for transformation. They provide the platform for businesses to reinvent themselves. And I think that shift, a couple of shifts for me certainly are. One is, traditionally it was the IT-led ERP, moving to business-led ERP, which means we focus more on growth strategies, customer centricity, profits, cost optimization, etc. Whereas it used to be an IT upgrade, focus on transactions, removing manual work. I think the other thing is the cloud side of things, going from traditional on-prem monoliths, where it was really hard to upgrade, really expensive to customize, where it's now, it's cloud. So you look at SAP S4 HANA, you look at Microsoft Dynamics 365, Oracle Cloud, etc. And those create a platform for businesses to really transform.
You said old, stuffy and transaction. I thought you were describing myself for a second. That's exactly how I am. I think ERPs, I think we're at a very interesting point in evolution. I think they definitely have a purpose for big corporations. I think big corporations kind of like them and hate them in equal measure. They're needed for organized data, which I think is increasingly important. They're good, obviously, typically around controls and structured processes and things, which I think big organizations like. But I think, if you're a new or agile organization, you're starting from scratch, I think, as we'll no doubt discover over the next period of time, I think, there may be the day of the old ERP is certainly up for reimagination and reinvention.
Super. And how has it evolved?
So I think for me, it's quite interesting. I spend more of my time with SAP than I have done with Oracle. But I think, where SAP are heading, I think is quite an interesting journey and an interesting evolution of how they see the future heading. So, you have the transactional layer sitting there underneath, and then they have created this product called Business Data Cloud, which is an acknowledgement that data is probably the biggest value element within an ERP. And that having that data, of course, is then the rich enabler for agentic AI and the use of AI. So I think, they are trying to position themselves as future relevant. And I think, data is the heart and center of that particular evolution for them.
And I do think it's fair. I think it's fair to say that the ERP programs do continue to be very long, expensive, hard initiatives, and I think it leads us into like what needs to be true for a ERP to kick off successfully, right? So before the rubber hits the ground and you're on the clock, kind of what are the non-negotiables really you feel should be in place before you even think about kind of kicking off in earnest?
Looking across the ERP transformations that I've done in the past, I think there's a couple of factors that are really important. One is defining really what your business case is. What are the benefits and the pain points that you have behind you, and do those stack up such that then you really get buy-in from the sponsors and the leaders of the business. And when I say the sponsors, it's not just the people sitting on the steering committee or paying the money for this, it's also the ultimate customers of the system. Because you put something in that's just sat in finance or sat in one part of the business, the custodians have to deal with the queries, and ultimately then you're looking at the parts of the business that are facing off to the customers externally potentially, and that really can cause a lot of pain and chaos in the business. So the buy-in from all sides of the business is really critical. I think where I've seen things work really well also in the past is if you come into a program like this with process knowledge already there and an understanding of where your process sits today, how it operates and what your requirements are, I think that really puts you in a good stead to start a transformation where you might have a systems implementation partner, or you probably will, but rather than spending precious money trying to rehash old as-is processes, get the people in the building to start focusing on that before.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing then for me is, what is the core leadership structure of the program before it starts? How do you dedicate resources from the business, from the tech teams and from the program teams? I think it really works well when you've got an accountability model that you have representatives or people dedicated from all those facets working as you hit the ground and as you start working.
And I think a couple of sort of builds from me, I think one of which is obviously choosing the right partner to work with. It's a bit like any kind of relationship. You don't entirely know all their behavioral characteristics before you join, but making sure that partnership is set up for success. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more as we move along. I think the other thing for me is be realistic in terms of your ambition. No one wants a jam tomorrow project 3 years hence. If you can break it out into manageable components where you can deliver value all the way along the journey, I think that makes a tremendous difference. We did that at BT very consciously. We had a very conscious strategy about which areas we wanted to deliver first. So we chose T&E because it was big impact across the whole business, but technically very easy to deploy. Then we went into management information because people really love that, even though we were feeding the data from the old systems. And then, we back-ended it with some of the ledgers and some of the consolidation stuff. So think about your strategy and don't try and deliver it all in one go if you can't. If you can break it apart into meaningful components, then do that.
And how have you both, when it comes to, when you think about the ERP not just being kind of just a techie backbone to the bit, but it's actually an enabler of change, enabler of transformation, enabling the business to stay relevant. How have you approached that end-to-end design, and particularly elements of the end-to-end, I guess, business model that don't sit in the ERP, but ultimately need to be considered to ensure the ERP is structured and set up for success? How have you, because it ultimately comes down to governance, being clear on what those decisions are and getting decisions made quickly, like I said, before you go into building anything that obviously you can't go back on. So how have you kind of both sort of individually made sure that end-to-end design is thought about and you've got the right people around the table and making the decisions quickly?
So I'm a huge enthusiast for kind of process change or process or global process ownership as a structure. And I think, most businesses don't organize themselves in process-centric ways. They tend to be traditional functional areas. So inevitably, you're going to have to reach out across departments, across functions. And I think, a properly defined global process ownership structure is the right way to get that brokerage, because you by definition and by default have to bring in people from different functions, and you have to go beyond the edges of the core scope, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly.
you need to know what your inputs are and also what your outputs are on the other side as well. So I think getting that right and having powerful, global process owners with credibility within the business whose views are respected and understood is massively important. London Stock Exchange, we had an amazing set of global process owners, very empowered, who were very efficient and effective at making decisions. And we came up with an incredibly and surprisingly clean design. Although the problem was, we realized afterwards, is that having done such a beautiful design, the delta between where we were and where we were going to was so massive that actually all we'd done is substitute it for a huge change challenge. But we did have a brilliant design because those guys were empowered to make the right decisions and beyond their immediate area of responsibility too.
I think the
Sarah?
challenge during design is, at the time you start talking about design, it's all conceptual, it's up there for the business. They don't quite know what it looks like ultimately. So you're asking a lot of people to take concepts and really put down and make them sign off in blood sometimes that their to-be process or their design is going to work for them in the future. And that can be really challenging, I think. And no matter how many workshops you have, no matter how many screenshots you provide, what I find is when you still go live, there can still always be gaps, challenges.
Yeah.
But I think that process ownership is key. I think it's how you bring the business into that world and understand. Some businesses that I've worked in don't have an understanding what process ownership means or looks like and what that accountability looks like for them. So sometimes it's a cultural journey, even just getting to that point, I think.
And what I've found really interesting, because I think I totally agree, that process owner role can be, to your point, if it's structured in the right way and it's framed in the right way, and can be very powerful. But how do you bring the business a lot, because it's ultimately the people putting in the customer data into the CRM system that then ultimately finds its way into an ERP, which if it's not done correctly, how do you make the business aware of their behaviours, whether it's CRM, whether it's following a PO process, so they understand the impacts of those behaviours on the success of the ERP? Because for me, that's a lot of some of the challenge.
So one arguably slightly cranky way in which I've approached this is I've always a big enthusiast of something called a get fit program, which is before you actually hit the ground running with the design and the build. You use the months whilst people are busy mobilizing and doing business cases and, getting all sorts of other things set up to actually do some productive preparatory work. So some of that is in obvious areas like data cleanse, but I think there's also a kind of process conformance piece. Look at the areas in the business where your processes are not working as intended. So say you're really committed to no PO, no pay, but actually your level of no PO, no pay is terrible. Really focus on getting that level up now, because when they go live, and that will necessarily force you into engagement with the business because it's them who aren't doing it right. So, and you make clear to them why and what the consequences are of not doing it and why it's important in the new world that you do it properly. So there's stuff that you can do ahead of the game, I think, to get the business engaged and thinking about how their behaviours and how their non-compliance drives bad practice or complexity. And obviously now with data mining tools and things like that, the actual evidence of it is a lot more visible.
Yeah.
And you can really show people in a very visually engaging way, all the screw-ups and complexities that they're generating.
I think a couple of other points from that is, we're touching or alluding on change management a little bit, because I think at the start of the program, you set out what your change management agenda will look like, referring back to the pain points and the benefits that you're trying to achieve. How do you set out your communications is really key. How do you develop your change networks, your change champions, and how do you get them from, this mobilization phase, as you talk about, through to what are the expectations for each of the phases? How are they going to work? How are they going to balance BAU? How are they going to then commit days on end or weeks on end to workshops and design outputs and documents that they have to sign off on processes? It's really, really difficult. but you need to almost coach them through that. That's, for me, one of the key success factors is the change management journey throughout the whole program.
And that business readiness group that Gareth referenced is really critical. And it should be framed in a way that, obviously that business readiness group is receiving instructions from you. And, you are telling them things that, you want them to do and giving them foreseeability in terms of what's to come. But actually it is a forum for them to feed back to you with concerns and issues, because they will know things that you don't know. And, you need to get them into an environment where they feel confident in sharing things and feeding back. And, once you start to act on those issues and items that they raise, even if it's just a sympathetic ear rather than actually doing anything about it, at least that, I think, encourages them to believe that they can be confident in engaging with you. And, I think that's a big help.
And do you think generally the balance is right in terms of external change support versus the internal organisation standing up change?
Oh, that's a really good question. I've seen projects in the past where we might get a business integrator or an external company come in and facilitate the change, and it's gone really badly because it's a theoretical change. It's not the hearts and minds that the business need. So I often defer to, actually, I'd bring in my own change team who would be then either employed by the business directly or sit under me. And they will then live and breathe it throughout yes, they can apply all the ADCAR models or the change models that they want. That's fine. But it's actually, like you say, John, it's about how you sit down with them, to listen to them, to understand the pain points, and move from there through those formal phases of the program. And they develop a trust relationship. Yeah. They develop a channel or a way in which they can actually communicate back to you with concerns, issues, etc.
And it's not an easy role either, is it? Because it's not theoretical, and for their role to be effective, they've got to understand the design, right? They've got to understand how the business works today, how it's going to work differently post the ERP investment, and then what does that mean for people's roles, responsibilities, the kind of racy across the business. What does it mean for the benefits case and how they support and drive? So it's not because there has to be a level of knowledge and understanding of the actual design itself, right, and the business model and how it changes, as opposed to a very theoretical high level change. This is change impact.
And
approach.
I think where some transformations go wrong is, and we probably come on to this a bit later, is A, is not spend enough money on data, and B, think that you're going to bring a change manager on towards the end of the project. Because we're going live on a certain date, so only then are we going to need people to help manage the change. And I think that's a fundamental flaw in the approach. Often when you're looking at business cases, it is expensive. So probably the first thing that the execs and the sponsors cut are change managers, because they just don't understand it. I think that is one of the things that you just cannot compromise on.
I remember my very first ERP program I went to. I'm not sure I dare mention his name, but he's a brilliant finance director. He's been my mentor and someone I've got a lot of time for. But I went to him and plugged in a couple of heads for change management early in the project. He said, "They're just tree huggers. Like, why do we need them?" And so
the numbers guy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if we were truly provocative, I'm sure, Carolyn, you could have asked a Big Four representative sit alongside us and tell why their change management is the best ever. I've had mixed experiences. I've actually had very good change management from a Big Four partner at my most recent assignment, and they were absolutely brilliant, and they brought great technology. But I think ultimately, the reality is that you don't want change done to you by someone else. It has to be organic and within. So even if you do decide to take the intellectual capital from a third party and maybe some of their expertise and some of their resource, ultimately you've got to own it, because it's going to be around long after they've disappeared from the scene.
Yeah,
absolutely.
What have you learnt about leadership in that context? Because I think change fatigue is a real thing. These programs often spin on for many years in a backdrop of recently COVID and Trump tariffs, etc., etc. What have you learned? I'm interested from the people side and the leadership side, leading through sort of change fatigue.
I'm glad Trump hasn't influenced anything directly that I've done in my career yet.
This podcast could take a turn.
I'm sure even now I'm not on any social media.
That's a different podcast. Yeah.
But I did delete my WhatsApp chats before I went to the States last time. So I think, change fatigue is a real thing. I mean, everyone is constantly in change. The new organisation I've joined, I'm astonished by how many in-flight projects and activities they're trying to spin out at the same time, and I think it does take its toll. But I think, it's a big investment. It justifies serious consideration and serious attention. It's, potentially genuinely transformational. And any leader worth their salt in the organisation is connected with a programme of this type should be fully invested in it. And I think Gareth's reference in passing sponsorship, great sponsorship is critical to the success of these programmes. And I've been lucky, I think, not all of my programmes have delivered completely, but it's not because the programme has been failing, it's because other business circumstances have typically got in the way. And I've had consistently good sponsorship. And it makes such a difference because you do run into barriers. One of the organisations I worked for, again, I won't mention them by name, but they were massively passive aggressive in their reaction to the ERP, and we were exposing a lot of bad accounting practice. The company was very federated, so CFOs and divisions could go and moan to their CEO, who then escalated up to the CEO, and it would come down to the CFO how unhappy they were. But my sponsor was resolute and determined and focused and fought the battles for me. And having that kind of focused, attentive, and considerate leadership, because it's a long journey, and sometimes you feel down and dispirited. Having their resilience alongside you is really helpful.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned change fatigue. I mean, these programs can be long, multi-year at times, and so you're asking a lot of the business, a lot of the program teams, and I hate to say it, but at the point you go live, it's almost like your foundation's there now. You've modernized, you've got a system or a platform. What next? And often everyone sort of slumps back in their seat feeling like they've done it. It's a crash. And we've asked a lot of people, working nights, weekends, sacrifices, family compromises, etc. But how do you need to get over that? Because AI is here. It's already ahead of us as we're talking. There's all these extra things that now, as a new system owner, you can be doing. As a business, you can be harnessing and taking forward with you. So change fatigue is real, but it can't be a blocker to continuing with improvement.
And can I just pick up very quickly just on that sponsorship leadership kind of point? If you find yourself, if you've come in to lead a ERP program, you find yourself in a situation where it is quite challenging political environment. What's your advice? I guess what's your advice to others that are in that position to get to a much more productive kind of sponsorship kind of situation before you launch in? Like how have you navigated? Like how have you navigated those challenging situations and got to the right?
I suppose
outcome?
Ultimately, though, the reality is that the investments are so big that they have the board behind them, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
fine.
it's very rarely that you'll, create an investment that's so boutique that, there isn't a great deal of attention and focus on it.
Yeah.
I think actually it's more problematical when things start to go wrong. So the initial, initially you go in full of enthusiasm, right, and vim and vigor.
Everyone
and
loves you.
Everyone's behind you, and then, you're the most loved creature, and also, you're offering opportunities to people. And I think it's when it starts to unravel, as sometimes it does, that you really work out where the proper sponsorship is.
Yeah.
Again, I've had one project we delivered it, but it had quite a troubled gestation because we identified huge and very large scale problems with data on the way, and Carolyn probably knows which company I'm talking about. There was a kind of temporary loss of confidence and loss of faith at that point. And, you could begin to see people going a little bit cold on the notion and starting to wonder, particularly as this particular organisation had 2 prior failed attempts to get it across the line. And that's when I think when you know who your friends are and you have to work extra hard to try and sustain interest and support for what you're doing. I mean, luckily, it's interesting at the moment, particularly in SAP world, because there's quite a big burning platform argument as well that kind of drives people's thinking around, whether or not to pursue an ERP program. It's really interesting to me, where I was at M&S, we did a greenfield deployment, we saw it as an opportunity to upgrade and to move forward and do something different. There are a lot of organizations, I think, out there evaluating ERP in the SAP space who are kind of thinking do minimum necessary just to keep us going.
Yeah.
And, so I think it depends on the scale of your ambition. But if you've got a really compelling reason to get it across the line, which we did at the company I referenced earlier, then even in those darker hours, there's usually enough board imperative and senior sponsor imperative, because their reputation is tied to it, right?
Yeah.
Particularly if it's a CFO sponsoring it, or indeed a COO or head of GBS or something, their own personal reputation is lined up to it, so that they can't afford to fail.
Just one final question, maybe on
They
sponsorship.
can afford to blame, mind. They can't afford to fail.
One final question on sponsorship from a lay person, I guess. And this has popped up times before, and I'm sure it's different in different organisations. Is the key sponsor, or should the key sponsor be the CFO or the CTO?
I think part of the sponsorship should be that, but I think my belief is that, yes, they may be the people who are funding it from their BAU pockets or their CapEx budgets, whatever. But I think when you're talking about sponsorship, it should also be who are the people who are ultimately going to receive either the data from the system, the reports, or ultimately going to interface with your suppliers, your customers, etc. I think it needs to be a joint effort. And I've seen in the past, yes, typically when you're talking finance transformation, of course, the CFO, the FD needs to be there, because if a supplier is not going to get paid and there's months of backlogs of invoices that aren't being paid, they're the ones who are going to be phoned and called and complained to. But if it's not just that, whether it's other parts of your business involved, you can't just spring this on them. They need to be working with you along the journey.
I firmly believe that big ERP projects, and don't forget ERP is not just defined by finance, it can extend into operations and manufacturing and all sorts of different areas. But I don't know whether this is the fashionable view or the unfashionable view. I believe the sponsorships should sit with the organisation that's getting the value. And technology is an enabler to make that happen. I think the days when technology ruled the roost and ran everything is, kind of out of date and out of kilter, and it's gone. And, they have a very important role, I think, in shaping the selection and choosing the right product and managing the architecture and defining the evolving technology roadmap. But really, they are just enabling value generation in a functional area, and therefore I think the CTO should sit back and not be the sponsor, unless it's like a super technical upgrade and there's hardly any business engagement, in which case it's probably fine.
Oh, and in what situations do you feel that tech upgrade is warranted versus? Because I find it interesting that the sort of kind of move towards a technical upgrade versus doing a proper business transformation. Appreciate there's a cost difference to those approaches, but what's your view on, is there ever a real reason just to do a tech upgrade?
If SAP tell you, then probably
Which is
yes.
what they are
Which is
doing.
what they are telling us, then probably yes.
I mean, it probably comes back to the start of the conversation. What is the reason for this? Have you been told, look, you're going to be no longer supported on your platform? Then there's obviously one reason. But I think baking that into some of the other reasons, might be a compliance or regulatory requirement. There might be some control failures in your audit environments or elsewhere. There might be new business units or integrations or mergers that might be taking place. Some of those reasons are apparent. It's not just that your system's been perfect and SAP comes along and says, oh, by the way, you need to change. That's not the driving factor. It should be the other way around. It should be, okay, what is it that we're not achieving this year or the next couple of years that we really need to do, and use that as the platform for growth.
And I think I'm seeing a little bit in the SAP space that some companies are reluctant to go beyond a technical upgrade or a brownfield upgrade to S4 because they're worried about the consequential impact. Their architecture is so tangled and complex. Gareth and I both worked for Penguin, or been associated with Penguin Books for a while. I joined Penguin, I'm ashamed to say, probably 30 years ago plus, and they had a product called Vista that was on the cusp of retirement, and it lasted at least 20 years
Yeah. So when we did the merger, Penguin and Random House, Vista was still there.
So people are terrified of
Yeah,
those,
absolutely.
those old connections, those old integrations, and the consequences and the destabilization that may come. So sometimes I think people just choose the path to least resistance to just move forward.
Yeah. And oh, sorry, you want to go? Just in, I guess, thinking about then as you move into the sort of the nitty gritty of a program, and I think you mentioned earlier about the partnership and the importance of choosing the right partners. And there's lots of options out there, and there's very much I feel that from what I've seen in the market, there's started to be a shift away from a one-stop shop to a multi-vendor approach, and to that. And I'd love to hear your own personal thoughts about that, right, and what the pros and cons of those options, or if indeed there are more options. But how do you guys personally go about choosing the partners you want to go on these journeys with?
So I think cynically, the big advantage of traditional Big Four or an Accenture and IBM is the single back to pat or more likely throat to choke. It's quite easy, I think, if you have a single partner to ascribe blame when things go wrong. I mean, they do bring, let's be honest, they bring a lot of knowledge, they bring a lot of methodologies, a lot of toolkits, a lot of expertise, although that expertise can be very inconsistently delivered, I find. And like all business partnerships, ultimately it's probably less the brand of the organization you buy than the individuals you buy. And so, I think there are... advantages, they do bring, some kind of minimum level of quality and guarantee of delivery. And, they do have access to lots of different resources and, different skills and capabilities. So they can do everything. And that is an advantage contractually, accountability-wise. It makes it quite straightforward. At M&S, where I was, the narrative of how we got there is probably too complicated to relay on this particular conversation, but we ended up a little bit through force of circumstance, ending up with a deliberately conscious multi-vendor strategy. So we had specialists in for data, for testing. We had a very niche company in for our design and build. We brought in other specialists into the change space and into the control space as well. And it was a very different experience. They were all excellent in their field and guaranteed excellent. It's all they did was their particular niche topic. So, you knew you were getting really good people guaranteed because their whole business was dependent on them being good at what they did. So that really helped. But it did mean that choreography was more challenging, making sure that they all kind of worked and played nicely together. And it clearly represented a very significant shift in accountability.
Yeah.
So actually, you couldn't blame one individual party for the whole thing falling, because accountability sat and resided with you, the company, as the owner of the whole undertaking. And actually, I didn't particularly mind that. I mean, I think there are advantages in being able to shift the blame, obviously, to other people. And, a couple of occasions I've grown quite good at it, actually. And I could spin a very constructive narrative, suggest that none of it was my fault and everything was in the responsibility of the service delivery partner. You can't do that. But actually, it was quite liberating, oddly, in a way, to know that you could be a bit more directional with them, but you also knew, as you instructed them, that you were very confident they were going to do what you wanted to a really good standard. Where, I have worked with a big organization where they'd had the whole panoply of services. They did everything. And in some areas, they were absolutely exceptional, but in a couple of critical areas, they were genuinely terrible. And it wasn't that they're a bad company, it's just they had bad people, or they didn't have the right people available on the day. So it was a really interesting shift from my perspective.
Yeah, I think on a practical level, there's probably three areas for me which really kind of lend themselves to deciding what model you want. And I think one is when you look at the two-in-the-box model. So you talked about, functional consultants. Yes, they go in, they do a job, they write some papers and design documents, but you need a process person sitting alongside that. So that is your design ticked off, and you make sure that you match the system to the process. On the data front, how are you going to get the old legacy data into the new system? You can't guarantee me that a big SI is going to have the data expertise to do that, because it depends on what tooling you might use to migrate the data, as an example. So I've seen it work really well where you basically create your own data capability for that program. And they come with They may be day raters or whatever, but they come with that knowledge and that expertise. And then I think we've talked about change. I think the change needs to be owned by the business. I think apart from that, then it's up to you how you structure the program, how many partners you want. I agree with you. I think often it's better having just one single partner, because you can sit across the table and look at them, the whites in their eyes, and understand exactly what their outcomes are due to be or their deliverables need to be, rather than having a round table conversation between people passing blame. It's just not productive, is it?
No. I think it's interesting what you said about change, because just to reiterate a point I made earlier, I think as more and more people are trying to adopt, not adapt, and fit to a standard design, which is kind of demanded. You want to get all of the upgrades and the refreshes from the products. Actually, the design process looks quite different from how it used to, which is very much kind of whiteboarded and what do you want and what can we give you, and let's build in lots of huge amounts of complexity into it. And actually, I think that has probably means that the design process theoretically is less risky. And it's a much more of a change challenge than a design challenge than it used to be, because you've got to get people to buy into that kind of adopt, not adapt mantra. So I think, some of the, more esoteric skills around design and build are kind of going away.
Right.
And actually it is becoming more of a change management and a data challenge. I think those are the two things that
Yeah.
would perplex me, I think, if I was starting another ERP, which actually I am. So that's what I'm worrying
You
about.
you raise a really good point around that, because we haven't really talked about, is it tech first or process first? And as we have to move to cloud platforms, often these are single lines of code. You can configure here and there, but you can't just customize the system as you wish. So often it means a lot more change management is required, because the process owners and those teams have to change their process significantly and really work out what does that mean for their operating model, what does it mean for their skills, their talents, etc. So we haven't really covered that off, but I think that's one of the critical things. Might make it simpler for you implementing the thing, because you just go configure the button left or right, but actually it's more onus on the organization themselves to adopt and embed that post go live.
Yeah, and I think it's a real shift. You can see it in other areas like testing, right? More and more testing is automated. There are some very snazzy tools for data migration, and if you do some investment in data up front, I think the challenges are shifting. The things that would screw up ERP programs in the past, which typically were overcomplicated, over-engineered design, are kind of going away and being replaced maybe by a different set of challenges around adoption and to some extent data still.
And do you think, obviously, John, you and I have worked reasonably closely together, haven't we, on particularly around operating model design and change alongside the tech change. And do you think enough programs think about the operating model enough beyond the standardized processes that come with the box? Do you think there is enough attention on that kind of how the organisation needs to shift and change ways of working, and how the roles deliver the work as opposed to just the tech that's underpinned by the technology?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at something like a merger or an acquisition, there's an obvious operating model impact, because you want to decide one system, go with that, and then you're going to have one team in the future, so you need to design what that operating model looks like. Where it's a little bit more opaque is you decide, okay, we've got a burning platform, let's put the system in, and you forget about phase 2, which may actually be the resulting operating model that needs to be considered. And that goes back to the point we were saying about change fatigue. We suddenly sit back and go, yeah, we've done this, the system's in. Oh, but now we've got to consider our process and our people. And that's often, I think, left to the side and not considered.
Yeah, so actually I've slightly different experience that every one except for one of the ERPs that I've been involved with or projects has had the target operating model directly connected to the deployment of the ERP. So it's been part of an integrated program to get the two traveling in parallel. So I in my case, organizations have thought about it. And, I think it's even more interesting and more challenging now, because obviously there is a spectre of agentic AI and, the impacts potentially are much more profound than they were previously. And also, I think, what do you do with information? So, the last 3 ERPs I've done have been connected with setting up reporting analytics centers of excellence, starting to think about how you can use predictive analytics and other capabilities to drive better insight and better information. So particularly in that space, I think there's quite a lot of organizational change that's coming and to come. And then also, we talked about change and the constant pace of change. How do you build out a transformation as usual capability? What does that look like? How do you embed global process owners not just as a program resource, but as a BAU resource? So I think there's a lot to play for in the target operating model space. And I think, evolving tooling and technology will probably make that premium even more important.
How do you view staffing up a program now in 2025? And is it a blend of internal talent, external resource and contractors, consultancies, etc.? How's that changed in modern
Cheap as
times?
possible.
Cheap as possible, but not compromising in things like data. There are people out there that just specialize in that particular data tooling that you might need to, take it from extraction through to transformation to loading and validating. Those people just do that day in, day out. Why would you compromise that when data is probably one of the biggest things that, if it's not done properly, you end up with problems post go live.
Or not even going live.
At go live, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm actually doing it at the moment, so I'm just thinking about building up my new team at the Crown Estate, and I'm putting quite a lot of thought actually into the right skills and capabilities. Where do I think roles intuitively benefit from in-house capability and knowledge to the extent that it exists? You're obviously a prisoner of what's available, because I think it is good to bring people into the program. It's a great development opportunity for them. I've worked with organisations with very significant offshore and outsourced presence, and they love projects like this and really want to get involved and engaged. So, I definitely think as many people as you can bring in internally. And good people too. I mean, I worked in one organisation where the only way you could get people from inside the organisation to join, which we did need for institutional business knowledge, was to basically get them drunk or drugged, and then get them to sign a piece of paper and wake up the next morning to finding they joined the programme. So it was the very definition of press ganging. Other organisations I've worked in, they've really brought the best talent very deliberately as a strategy. They've said, we won't put the best people in the organisation. So that's worked out. And then there are a lot of good contractors out there. A lot of people have been around, and this is an advert for Gareth and I for our future career paths as well. A lot of good people who've been around who aren't associated with big brand, big four companies who know...
Not to be drunk.
Yeah, we don't be well, I'll sign anything given the right circumstances. But, we need, there are really good contracts out there, been and done this stuff previously, and I've had some great experiences. And obviously there are professional and specialist firms whose expertise and knowledge you can't easily source or reliably source, because there's always a degree of calculated risk with contractors. Even if you worked with them previously, they may not fit into the domain. And obviously each business has its own unique attributes. I mean, I've worked in lots of different sectors. I'm not necessarily wedded to the knowledge that you can't work in one sector and then move into another sector, but equally, it helps to have people with deep knowledge of telco or deep knowledge of retail or deep knowledge of financial services in certain areas. So, but I think it's something to think really deeply about. Don't underinvest in making sure you get the right mix of talent and the right mix of capabilities.
And I think another way to put it is what capability do you need beyond the program?
Yeah.
So I think about my most recent program. We did 30 plus integrations. So they're technical in nature, but you let those people leave at the end of the project, or who's going to understand? You're talking to customer platforms, you're talking about downstream systems, upstream systems. Do you feel it necessary to keep those kind of skills on beyond the program is the big question.
So I want to know more about what kind of drives you both, right? These are, we said these are hard jobs, right? These are hard programs. Like how do you keep yourselves resilient through these journeys? John, I mean, I know
The
both
scorn
of
of
you
my
done
wife and my daughters if there isn't a paycheck.
as well as maintain your marriages.
That's quite a big
maybe down
motivating
the pub
factor.
rather than here. But
Someone asked me about...
how do you do that? How do you keep the energy levels up and the momentum and the positivity and
Well, I think luckily I'm quite naturally optimistic and upbeat. It was interesting, someone asked me, why do I do finance transformation, and what's the thing that keeps me going. My brother is an architect, and so he leaves a legacy of beautiful buildings around Cambridge and London, the area where his practice is located, and he's got this beautiful legacy that will stand for 100, 150 years. you can't do that having, mistakenly ended up pursuing a career in finance as I did. That option is not quite as easily achievable. But actually, what we're doing, Gareth and I, whether it's purely technologically a deployment or whether it's a technology-enabled deployment with a big TOM component, a target operating model component, it does leave a legacy. It's making a big difference to business over the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years. And I think, knowing that you're making a difference and that you're delivering something that will really change people's lives, the way the business operates, improve the quality and the efficiency of the business, and will have durability, has always been a big appeal to me. The idea of doing a sort of month end after month end after month end, or business budget review after business budget review, just doesn't do it for me. I like this kind of permanence and the transformational element. Being an agent of change. Yeah, and there are peaks and troughs, and it can be emotionally wearing from time to time. But at the end of it, if it goes well, and Gareth's just emerged from a successful deployment, it's a very satisfying place to be. And you can, Graham Baker, who was my boss at Smith & Nephew, had coined this phrase, which, I apply to a lot of projects I work in, and, I think is a really good kind of 2-word value set, is proud and restless. That's how I think you should feel if you work in finance transformation and ERP programs.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things for me. You mentioned legacy. I mean, I've worked for the last 10 years in media, and we know media is changing, has to change. Print is dying, etc. So leaving a legacy of something, absolutely, but also working with these businesses to change and keep up with whatever's coming down the road in terms of generating new revenue streams, etc. That is fascinating for me to see and watch and be part of. And I think on a day-to-day basis, for me, it's about working with the people around you. There's nothing, these are hard, these are challenging. But knowing you can get out of bed in the morning and you've got people around you who want to solve problems, roll up their sleeves, deal with issues, and they're just genuinely good people, that is what keeps me going on a day-to-day basis. I personally hate month ends. I just don't want to be working on a Saturday, Sunday doing a month end either. So I'd rather stick in this game.
Yeah.
So what are the fun things that you do with your teams through these programs to keep the momentum, keep the mood light through the dark times of testing and kind of pre-go live readiness, etc.
Make them false promises.
apart from what John said earlier,
which we won't repeat.
Well, given they arrive drunk and drunk, it doesn't really matter what you do with them after that. Look, I think internal team spirit, internal communications. So again, every large-scale program I've run, we've obviously been mindful of external communications. We're also very much mindful of internal communications. And making sure that we create events and situations where people can interact. I think it's often you've got a very complex delivery model where you've got, third-party providers, you've got contractors, you've got employees, and to try and create a sense of team and common purpose through events. I think defining ways of working, building all the traditional mechanisms around trust and behaviors and respect for each other's competencies and things like that. Sometimes it sounds a bit kind of tree hugging, to paraphrase what my CFO said, or a bit saccharine, but actually it's worth investing in. And, when times are low, sometimes you just have to accept the reality of where you are and, go out and do a team event or, do something crazy or ridiculous, just to break the mood and reset the next day. So I would not never skimp, I think, in terms of creating an environment where your team, with all of its different parts, feel, collectively engaged in the enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, the term coined is forced fun. A lot of people just want to come in and do the job, but for us, it's important also to make sure you take half an hour out of the day, do an all hands or do a session where you can do a silly quiz. Small things like that just keep the teams engaged, because what you forget, often these are hundreds of people, and they will sit in their silos, won't they? Yeah. They won't interact with anyone else. They won't know what's going on across the program. But those small snippets give them a chance to actually take themselves away from what they're doing and just be involved in something else, even though it's forced, but it is fun.
And if you could think of one thing that during an implementation where your heart stopped, you had a heart-stopping moment, what was it? And kind of how did you address the situation, and how did you, I guess, what was the learning from it?
Well, mine was undoubtedly the impact of the M&S cyber attack. So, in the middle of a program through to be told, that all of our systems were in effect disconnected and that all of the resources you had internally focused on the program were being repurposed to support the recovery effort for M&S was quite a heart-stopping moment for me, and it's partly why I'm not there anymore. We did explore different options around how we might navigate our way around it. I mean, ERPs, when you're working on them, seem to be the most important thing in the world, and to you at that moment in time they are. But organisations are subject to all sorts of external pressures and variations and challenges around funding or acquisitions and divestments or acts of God or tariffs or whatever, and you don't control the world, right? And sometimes you have to roll with things that are unexpected or you never imagined would happen, and it's life.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the one moment that strikes me is when we were doing the Penguin Random House merger. The go live was meant to be in June 2020. We were all gearing up to be, in hotels, in person, do this big cutover together, and then COVID hit. And that was a moment of real, what is going to happen now? And thankfully, the leadership were brave and courageous. And at that time, digital tools were, are they real? Do they work? But we had to take that step, and everyone had to really kind of come around together and work this out. But I mean, I just remember those early days of, not being in person, and like we all do today, we're now on camera, but that was a real alien feeling for us all.
I think we'll have a few future or aspiring finance transformation directors listening to this. Is there one piece of advice you would give them now before starting their first ERP program?
I think volunteer, it's a great opportunity to get yourself into a program of this type. Some people I know approach it with apprehension and anxiety and worry. It's kind of because at the end of it, there's no guarantee, right, that you will have a job to go back to at the end of it. So, I think the first thing I would say is that volunteer, be engaged. It's a great opportunity to learn. There is a calculated risk attached to getting involved in a transformation program because by definition they have finite lives. And there can be no guarantee at the end of a project that you will have a role necessarily in the organization, but necessarily you will have learnt an enormous amount about teamwork, about technology, about process, about behaviors, about change. There's so many disciplines and skill sets that it provides you with that, if you've learnt wisely and carry those skills on into other organizations or other roles, that you will be richer for the experience. And I've 20 years in finance transformation. I've absolutely no regrets about how I've spent my time at all.
Yeah, I would agree. I couldn't say anything better than that. But I would say though that, these are roles that you just need to roll your sleeves up in. For me personally, accountability is a big principle, a value for me. So whether you're doing it yourself and you've got a big title, but you've actually got to do some spreadsheet work or whatever it might take to move the project forward, I think that's a key thing. Starting out, be prepared for anything that might come your way. You also don't know. There are so many challenges that you face that you just don't know the answers to up front. So how you deal with those, how you come out of those is also more important than, thinking that I know everything at the start of those programs.
Super. John, Gareth, Carolyn, really appreciate your time today. Fascinating discussion. I think you made ERP interesting for a lot of people today, and certainly more fun than it sounds. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.